Hey friends, welcome back. Now, let's dive into another very interesting topic, which is important if you want to deliver a great report experience for your audience, which is the so-called cascading filters. Let me show you the problem, and then let's dive into the solution. At first, let me click on a new page and let's visualize something. Let's say I'd like to see my customer countries go with the orders table and using the customer countries. Let's go with customer country. Here we go. And instead of seeing a map, I'd like to see this actually as a bar chart. So let's say here, using here the columns, the cluster columns here, and make this a little bigger, drag it down, then visualize, let's say any kind of measure here. Let's say the amount which has been sold, right? Take this option, and then you see here the countries, and we can see here clearly the leaders here is United States and Germany, which we sell most of our products to, right? So far, so good. And maybe let's do a few additional things here, just turn on the data labels and also make sure that we filter out the little issue we have. So if we go to the customer country here and take this option here and say we'd like to don't like to see this here on here. Okay, so first, okay, so that's fine. Now, let's say I'd like to filter this data. We can easily do this. I could say I have categories here. I can take the categories and say I'd like to see this as not as a table, but as a table. But as a slicer, okay, so I can choose a slicer, visual for that, and I have my categories as slicers. And let me maybe increase the size so you can see this better. Let's go to the item section here and say for the text size, let's say 15. Okay. So 15. Okay. So we can see all the categories we have in the data set, and we can use them as filter. And please feel free to adjust the filter the way you want it. Let me take the head out for now. And maybe you make it vertically. You can change the color, the font, and so on. So it's up to you. But the main behavior is the following. If I take something, let's say cheese, I would see the data for cheese, right? If I take my drinks, I would see the data for drinks. So you see that the visual itself adjusts automatically. And this is nothing new. This is not unusual. This is expected actually, right? Because we filter here from table. In this case also from data, which comes from the same table. So if we go to the data view, and it's crucial to understand both of these, let me just zoom in. Okay. Okay. Here we go. So there was a little bit too much. Yes, let me zoom out a little bit. Okay. So we can see that the oldest table here, this one, and we currently use the category. And we use it to filter the customer countries, right? And their amounts. And category and customer country are both coming from the oldest table. So there is no issue. We can easily do that. Now, let's say we also use here the suppliers for filter. So let's go back to the report view and say, I'd like to have another slicer. Go with slicer option. Take on the slicer and say I'd like to see all the supplier names. So all our suppliers. I can go with the supplier name, take this option, and I have all of them. And maybe I also like to increase the text size here so you can see the better new screens. Go with the items and say I'd like to see this as 15. Okay. So far so good. Now, there are a lot of suppliers, of course, in here. That's so defined. But if I now filter, let's say the category and say I'd like to see the data for cheese. Take this option. Okay. And you see that the visual adjust. Now, I use another slicer here, which is a supplier name. And I say, okay. Now I'd like to see data for cheese, but oh, there's a supplier, which is called Order and so on. And I take this option and what do I get? I get here blank visual. And this is exactly the problem because this, of course, is not really customer friendly, right? This is not what our report consumers would like to see. In fact, from my experience, most often they hate something like that because this is not really a good experience. Why is this actually happening? Well, the reason why this happens is quite simple. The reason is there is no combination of cheese and this supplier. So this supplier obviously doesn't provide cheese. And that is why if we filter both of them, so from these two visuals, there is nothing in here, right? Because this combination does not exist. And the reason or the problem is that these filters are currently not cascading. And cascading means that if you select, for instance, cheese from this visual, you would only like to see the suppliers, which actually provide the category cheese. So obviously this provider is not doing that. So this provider should not be visible. The suppliers should not be visible currently in the selection, as long as we have here cheese selected. I only like to see the supplier names, which actually provide a cheese as category. How to achieve this? Well, we need to go back to the model view first to understand why this happens. This happens because the order table, of course, is currently filtered from the one side, which means the suppliers table here, from the one to the many, filters the orders table. So I can use a supplier name to filter my orders table. However, I cannot use my orders table to filter my suppliers table. So if I choose a category, which is here coming from the orders table, I cannot filter to the suppliers, which provide this category, because the relationship is from the one side to the many side, and the filter direction is from the one side to the many side. This is indicated by this arrow here. Now, the first idea, which might come to mind for instance, for you, for me as well, would be, of course, well, let's turn off the turn on the bidirectional relationship. So instead of using the filter direction in one, so from one to many side, you can, of course, double click here to edit the relation, right? And then you can see this window, and you could say, I'd like to actually have cross filter direction into both, right? You could turn this on. However, this is something you would like to avoid. Because if you turn both directional filtering on, depending on the complexity of your model, this can at first slow your whole model down. So it costs performance. And the second issue might be that, as I said, if the model is quite complex, then this might lead to ambiguity in your model, which means that you get results from filtering, which are completely wrong. They are messed up because your model then has many ways to filter the data because it can flow through many relationships to filter the specific data you currently use or visualize. So bidirectional relationships are most often to avoid. So this is just best practice in my personal experience. Okay, there are use cases for using them, but most of the time, if you can avoid them, avoid them. So, okay, long story short, this is not the way we want to, well, create a solution. So what else can we do? Well, we could go back to our report view here, and we can use actually a tax calculation for that. Because all we need to ensure is if we filter something from this table, then please only show the suppliers for which, or for who is actually for which supplies, there's actually data in the orders table. And then in this case, the filtered orders table. So the most easiest way to do it, which I really think is kind of neat. And that is why I like to share this idea with you here is right click on, in this case, our measures table, create a new measure. So I take this option here. And the measure is quite simple, because the measure itself will only be the orders. So let's call this count orders. And what it does is we use the count rows function, count rows. So count the number of rows in a table, and refer it to the orders table. And this is the whole tax expression we need. So please count all the rows in the orders table, which by default, of course, would be simply a high number. So depending on how big your order table is, however, this can be used as a filter for the visual, in this case, the slicer. So what we do is we use the measure we have created here, and we select the slicer, which is in this case, this one here. And then we simply drag the measure inside the filter area of the slicer. So if we drag and drop it here, then we have the option to use any kind of filtering, and the expression we want to use is not blank. So if you tick this option, like that, then the final thing you need to do is apply this filter. And watch what happens for our current selection, cheese here, with the supplier names. If we turn this apply filter on, if I tick this option, you'll see that now there are only 4 suppliers left. And these are the suppliers which actually provide the category cheese to us. So now I could go in here, select the first one, and you still see data, right? So that works completely fine. And you also see that if you click this one here, this is one which only provides cheese, and that is why the other options are gone here. Because the filter direction from the suppliers table here to the orders table, and therefore to the category, those are still in place by the model. Okay. So that works fine. If I untick this, then you can see all of them. And the same is true, untick this, then you see all the supplier names. If you tick on, for instance, drinks, then I would only see supplier names for drinks. If I tick on dessert, I would only see them for dessert. And if I tick something here, you see that this works perfectly. And this is the solution for the cascading filters. And this is a much better user experience, because now you always show something in here, right? And don't have this, I select something from here, then from here, and for some reason, my visual is simply empty then. This will not happen if you apply this cascading filters. And this is a really great trick, at least for my point of view, because you do it with a really easy to use DAX expression, it simply counts the rows. You add this to the filter to make sure that you only see the relevant supplier names, and you avoid the issue with the bidirectional relationships in the model. Okay. You don't mess with that. Okay. So that's it for this trick. So hopefully you can use this. It's very often happening in reports, but my experience, and it's good to know how to fix that quite easily. Okay. So that's it. Thanks a lot for watching. And as always, see you in the next video. Best, guys.